So the next 40% that you want to worry about is content, and make sure that you do look at these items in this order. First worry about structure and then worry about content. And within content, you have many elements. First, you want to make sure that you have paragraphs that are relevant. This again starts in the reading and pre-writing phase of what you're doing here. So start with quotes, start with evidence from whatever text you're looking at that makes sense and that is relevant. And then when you build those quotes into claims and into paragraphs, make sure that you stay relevant to your argument. You also want to make sure that you have enough evidence. So sometimes a standard 3 quotes per body paragraph really does the trick, and you've got enough support for what you're trying to argue. Sometimes you might want to add additional evidence. If you're worried about this, err on the side of caution, include more, and you can always cut it down later. It's also important to remember that you cannot just put your finger down on the paper and select whatever quote your finger has hit. You will not receive points just for putting random evidence into your paper. So you need to make sure that you select quotes that do properly support the argument. Instead of analysis, or you have just restated what the quote says in your own words, or your analysis doesn't go into enough depth. A good rule of thumb here is to remember that you should always be talking about how the author is doing something and why the author is doing that. So what is the technique that the author is using, and what's the author's purpose? And then you do need to tie that back to your argument. And remember, the argument should be divided cleanly into those sub-thesis statements and then into the even smaller argument with the claims. So your analysis should be something that ties all of those elements together. You'll also lose points for ineffective, redundant, or confusing analysis. Ineffective just doesn't work. Redundant means you're repeating yourself, so maybe you're trying to analyze 2 quotes that are too similar, or maybe you're analyzing one quote in the same way that you did the previous quote, even though you have got a different claim. And confusing just doesn't make sense. Make sure you understand that good introductions don't just mean that you've followed the format of an attack sentence, a summary of the context of the reading, and then a thesis statement. You need to have certain essential details about the text and the argument, and it should be interesting. If it is boring, or if it's too over the top, so let's say you get a little crazy with the attack sentence, this is a weak introduction, and that's a bad way to start a paper off. Remember, that's the first thing that your reader is looking at. Likewise, you want to make sure that you're careful with the conclusion. Think of it like running a race. If you are almost at the end of your race, you do not give up, throw yourself down in a heap on the floor, and just say that you can't do any more. You do not slow down to a little trot instead of running quickly. At the very end of a race, you speed up. You give it your best, you give it your all. That conclusion is the end of your paper. That should be your most significant points. It should give implications of the argument, and it should do something really interesting that is not repetitive or boring. Otherwise, you are leaving your reader with your worst work in their mind. Finally, you will lose points if you have an inaccurate rendering of the text as a result of not reading closely or not reading at all. This is where you write something along the lines of Romeo and Juliet lived happily ever after at the end of William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but it could also be that you didn't read closely enough and you missed something important that happened, maybe something that was not explicitly stated but that the author gave a lot of evidence had happened, maybe something that a character kind of needed you to read in between the lines to understand.